was in a state of awe the first time I saw this painting in the MoMA Museum of Art, a portrait of the art critic Félix Vignon by Paul Signac, a French painter who is a pivotal figure of the era of Neo-Impressionism. The portrait was made unique by the way in which it is dotted, on account of the painting technique devised by Seurat, who named it divisionism but aptly called pointillism. The style bloomed during the 1880s, in a time when modern art was recently making a revolutionary shift from the intricacy of realism to the dreamlike luminosity of Impressionism, by the hands of Manet, Renoir, Degas, to name a few. Impressionism gave birth to a style in which artists depicted or froze the passage of time by means of paint, a subject matter of the countryside, light-filled summer afternoons, lavish leisure time, loose brushwork, and what you may consider blurry compositions. But it strikes me as a sort of an evocation, a memory, an impression the artist had on that moment and delivered to the canvas. Simply put by Cézanne, for an impressionist to paint from nature is not to paint the subject, but to realize sensations. Although art was restless to take a new scientific approach stemming from Impressionism, and that's where Georges Seurat comes in The Sunday by Le Grand Jade painting, where he used mindful dots instead of arbitrary brushstrokes. The style wasn't fully out of the blue. Pointillism in fact is a style in which art intertwined science. Assured by Seurat, the Neo-Impressionists studied in depth the works of many color theorists such as Michel Chevreul and Agustin Rud. In his book, Chevreul's most famous contribution to color theory is the law of simultaneous contrast, which takes account of how our perception of color changes relative to adjacent colors. To better understand, take this as an example for The Grass in the Shadows. Seurat uses darker greens intermixed with flecks of pure blue and even some orange and maroon. These are very unexpected colors for grass, but when we stand back, the colors blend optically, scientifically called optical mixture, resulting in a cooler, darker, and duller greens in the shadows, proving the artist's application of analogous colors, and that's the technical magic of pointillism. This new technique of rendering moments into juxtaposed dots attracted a man called Vincent van Gogh by his friend Paul Signac, who convinced him into pointillism. Although Vincent's stark artistry didn't stop there, as any other good artist urging to push their craft to its fullest potential, even sometimes at the expense of sanity. On his quest to achieve a unique luminosity, he realized that if pointillism was about dots, Van Gogh stretched that dot and gave the world many great paintings on the marvelous Starry Night that puts the Neo-Impressionists and later the rest of us to a state of wonder. These paintings rarely fail to make you feel something, considering local, color, temperature, and atmospheric perspective. In a letter to Maurice Bugach, Seurat divided the painting's emotional effect into three auras: gaiety, calmness, and sadness. Gaiety of tone is given by the dominance of light, of color by the dominance of warmth, of line by lines above the horizontal. Calmness of tone is given by an equivalence of light and dark, of color by an equivalence of warm and cold, and of line by horizontals, although sadness is given by the dominance of dark, of color by the dominance of cold colors, and of line by downward directions. So from the emotional to the sciencey, what these paintings rely on gave way to the principles driving TV and display technology today. And the evolution of that technology is similarly characterized by arrangements of dots or squares and rectangles of basic colors, cathode ray tubes, CRT for short, and since the digital imagery came along, pixels took over on similar pointillism principles. And from Seurat to digital screens everywhere, the evolution of the color dots has proved central to the creation of digital images worldwide. And despite other paintings' methods like the Roman obsession with anatomy and musculature, or the depiction of divinity and godlike Saturnalia, pointillism was something a bit different, something more down-to-earth yet vividly direct. Nonetheless of its complexity, it wasn't only an artistic style in which Neo-Impressionists wanted to display diligence or systemize a new method to paint, but it has undertones of stark social criticism. The deeper you look, the more you'll notice surprising inclusions and juxtapositions. In Le Grand Jade, for example, in the left foreground, a working-class man in shirt sleeves overlaps a much more formally dressed middle-class gentleman in a top hat holding a cane, a musician practicing or probably playing trumpet to the enjoyment of two soldiers standing at attention in the background, a woman in a pompous stance with an eccentric pit monkey on the right, all the way to the distant rowing crew of workers crossing over with an upper-class woman on board. The crowdedness of the painting vividly echoed class distinctions and the solitary impression, with the characters seemingly sharing the bank of the river but patently isolated from one another, and more acutely, each is thinking about their own words. In Battles at Aniers, another painting by Seurat, which takes place on the other side of the river facing La Conchade, another depiction of class distinctions in Paris, smokestacks and workers with hay hats, bowler hats, reassuring their class position, the informality of their gathering, and more astonishingly the main character's hunched body posture. And what Seurat wanted to make clear here, if you look at the contour you would see that it's sort of illuminated. He didn't do it here nor here, but here, which may seem that Seurat wanted to emphasize the shimmering aura of exhaustion or submission that quotes the painting's main character. While further back, top had a couple of high-status leisurely being rowed across by another worker with rolled-up sleeves. And here by location, with the wealthier patrons seated in the lower tiers, and by dress and posture, which gets markedly more casual the further the spectators are from ringside. A reverse suggestion by Seurat on capitalism, where the strong centralized government in which the state owns the means of production and guides the economy, leaving behind the lower class to bear pauperism. Many other paintings followed, so that criticism on social unrest, Signac, Luce, and other social anarchist painters captured the light on the socially underprivileged. By giving a platform to the voiceless, what started as an art technique became a waking call to writers and anarchy emerging from the same lower class the government neglected, but pointillism has put at center stage. Contributing to the spring of the anarchistic movement, propaganda of the deed skimmed by anarchists, including Fignon, Signac, Pissarro, Luce, whom not only glorified anarchy but supported it financially. Saturated by violence, the propaganda of the deed contributed to 11 bombings during the 1891 and 1894 in France alone. Abroad, the movement ensured the famous Haymarket riot in the US by industrial workers against dismal and dangerous working conditions and low wages, followed by the assassination of the Austrian Empress Elizabeth in Vienna by an anarchist whose motif was agonizing negligence. Anarchy wreaked havoc across Europe and the US at the time that advanced governments launched new investigative systems into their national security to prevent such acts. In France, further investigations were carried to trace the source. Later, the police talked about some suspected active anarchists, including Maximilien Luce and Félix Fignon, who have been claimed as a vital anarchist through his bold writings. They had him shadowed and eventually imprisoned until his release, along with Luce and some others in 1892. Fignon's love for art was absolute, devoting his time, intellect, and money to art with not much in return but the reverence of his friends. He was a crucial figure in the launching of careers of many influential artists like Matisse, who have gotten his first ever contract through Fignon in 1907. Seurat would have given up on painting and art as a whole. His family was not interested in his paintings. They didn't like his revolutionary inclinations. He wasn't well known and died young. If not for Fignon, Seurat would have been forgotten, since the former supported him financially and intellectually. And it is no surprise to why the MoMA entitled a whole exhibition under his name. Which gets me back to the portrait you saw in the opening. It's actually a paying homage to Fignon for his deeds to the art scene and to the neo-impressionists. In the canvas, Félix Fignon offers a kaleidoscopic pineaway resembling an undulating smoke, the one that rises from a fire or an explosion. The spiraling, colorful, abstract designs implies a reference to the aesthetic theory of Charles Henry and other color theorists, also stemming from Signac's inspiration of the Japanese woodblocks that he used to collect and which sits in the MoMA Museum today. Still on the roundness of the painting's theme, objectively, the flower is in fact called a cyclamen, carefully chosen by Signac to seal the spherical gist of his composition. But objectively, it is Signac's expression of reverence and admiration to his friends. To Fignon, the cyclamen is after all a peaceful deposit to a new era in which the government should equally serve its people. Throughout his career, Fignon always urged the hierarchical regimen to tighten the gap between classes and for a system devoid of negligence and stratification. I look at this artistic movement or cause for an instance, its influence, the scientific artistry indulged to create the artwork. Days, let alone months, spent with a canvas trying to prove a point, a whole style that would have never came to prominence if it wasn't due to the friendship. In front of it now, I feel forced to remember what bonds us as humans. We also are small dots that forms a bigger whole when looked at from a distance. but it is the artist's ability to deliver what they feel and think about their space-time, community, and their own beings that's able to give you that scope. See, I tend to measure good artists by the integrity behind their expressions, their presentation of unfiltered truths put together through hard work and wrapped with beauty. Some too I regard advisable in assessing what we call art. Therefore, I can confidently say that good artists are aesthetically genuine biographers of the human race when you can really see into what they create.